She froze at the elevator doors, her reflection fractured across the gold-plated panels. The city lights outside the penthouse windows flickered against her tired eyes, casting shadows that mirrored the weight she carried. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor, a rhythm that suddenly felt absurd against the laughter echoing from the boardroom, laughter that wasn't meant for her, but at her. Elaine Brooks, a 41, had spent years piecing herself back together after a divorce that had left her both exhausted and determined. And yet, in that moment, a room full of assumptions threatened to undo her carefully rebuilt dignity. Her sensible blazer, her worn laptop bag, her quiet confidence, none of it seemed to matter. The young executives mistook her for something she wasn't, something smaller than she had fought to become. The air hung thick with embarrassment and disbelief, and for the first time in years, she felt the familiar sting of invisibility. She stood still, breathing slowly, forcing herself to reclaim control even as her heart raced. And then the door opened, and the man who could decide everything about this moment stepped inside, unaware of the collision of pride, expectation, and the truth waiting to unfold. If you've ever felt seen as less than you are, this story might feel familiar. Let's begin. The room went quiet the moment the young man said it. His voice wasn't loud, just careless enough to cut through the music. "Sir, your entertainer is here." The word hung in the air like something sour, and every face in the penthouse lounge turned toward Elaine Brooks as if she had stepped into the wrong world. She froze just inside the doorway. The soft carpet cushioned her feet, but it did nothing to steady her. A blush rose from her collar to her cheeks, hot and sharp. For a moment she wondered if she had misheard, but the shift in the room told her she hadn't. A few of the younger men snickered quietly, one elbowing another as if this were some joke arranged for their amusement. Elaine tightened her grip on the strap of her worn laptop bag. It dug into her shoulder the way her past dug into her memory deep. Familiar, unwelcome. Her blazer, neatly pressed despite the years on its seams, suddenly felt like a costume no one believed in. She tried to clear her throat, but no sound came. She had spent the entire elevator ride rehearsing what she would say in this briefing, trying to calm her nerves. The gold-plated walls of the elevator had thrown back her reflection in a warped shimmer, tired eyes. Fine lines at the corners, hair pulled neatly behind one ear. She had tried to smile at herself. It hadn't worked, and now, standing under the pale chandelier light, she felt that distorted reflection become painfully literal. A slim brunette in a sparkly dress turned toward the man who had spoken. "That's not the entertainer," she whispered sharply, but the damage was already done. Elaine could feel the eyes on her judging, amused, dismissive. She took one small breath, then another, hoping it would steady the tremor in her chest. "I'm here for the Caldwell briefing," she said finally, the words scraping their way out. The young man blinked, confused for only a second before embarrassment flickered across his face. But instead of apologizing, he looked away, muttering something to his friend. A tight laugh slipped from one of them. Elaine felt the humiliation settle like a weight on her sternum. This wasn't new. People had underestimated her before. But being mistaken for something cheap, something ordered, felt like someone had reached inside her and pressed on the bruise she'd carried since her divorce. She thought she'd healed. Apparently not. She swallowed hard and straightened her shoulders. She had survived the layoff, the quiet afternoons in her empty apartment, the bills stacked on her kitchen counter. She could survive this too. She had to. A voice behind the bar called out, "The CEO should be here any minute," as if that would solve something. Elaine forced her eyes to the floor-to-ceiling windows instead. The city spread out below winter lights scattered over the dark grid of Chicago. For a second, it looked almost gentle. Almost. She turned to leave the group behind when another voice cut through the tension. Elaine Brooks. She turned slowly. Michael Caldwell stood in the doorway she had just come through, tall and composed in a charcoal suit. His presence didn't silence the room because it was already silent. His presence added weight to it. He didn't look at her. At first, his eyes were on the group of men still shifting uncomfortably near the bar. Whatever had happened, he had walked in at exactly the wrong moment. Then his gaze reached her. There was something in his expression, confusion first, then a quick, subtle flicker of assumption. She saw it land on her blazer, her small frame, the laptop bag she hugged too tightly. She watched the moment he put the wrong pieces together. It lasted only a few heartbeats, but those heartbeats felt like a second humiliation, layered over the first. He opened his mouth, closed it, and tried again. "You're Ms. Brooks." Her stomach tightened. She managed a stiff nod. He ran a hand across the back of his neck, a gesture that almost looked like discomfort or guilt. She couldn't tell. They said he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The silence between them finished it for him. Something inside Elaine fractured just a little. "I should go," she said quietly, turning toward the door. She couldn't bear standing there another second, surrounded by soft music and softer cruelty. "Ms. Brooks, wait." His tone shifted, lowering, steadier now, not commanding, asking. She stopped only because dignity told her she shouldn't run. She faced him again, but her breath felt thin. She could already feel the humiliation staining this moment, threatening to drown out every effort she'd made to rebuild her life since leaving Colorado. He took one step closer, careful, almost cautious. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, but she heard the unspoken part of the sentence clearly, one he had quietly contributed to. Elaine didn't respond. She couldn't trust her voice not to shake. He glanced briefly at the young executives who had caused the scene. They shifted under his gaze, but he said nothing to them. Not yet. He looked back at her, and she thought she saw something soften in his eyes, a recognition maybe, or the beginning of an apology that hadn't yet formed into words. She waited, holding her breath without meaning to, but he didn't speak. And in the stillness between them, with the city humming faintly through the tall windows, Elaine felt the question rise in her chest with a quiet, aching sharpness. Would this man, this CEO she had come here to work with, believe who she was? Or would he believe the humiliation she was standing in? Michael Caldwell froze in the doorway. And the worst part, for a split second, he believed them. The sharp clink of ice against the crystal tumbler in his hand sounded louder than it should have, each note echoing off the polished penthouse walls. He hadn't expected anyone to arrive yet. The dim, amber lighting made the room feel smaller, tighter, as though the air itself had thickened around him. Elaine Brooks stood there, a laptop bag hanging from one shoulder, her heels clicking lightly on the marble floor. To his eyes, every detail seemed somehow wrong. Her posture too tentative, her expression careful, yet not matching the polished confidence he had imagined for the senior consultant he was expecting. He blinked, his mind running a brief, horrifying loop. Did she belong here? The thought shot through him like a cold needle. He could feel the heat rise to his collar, a flush he hadn't noticed in years. He'd thought he had trained himself to judge quickly, decisively. But in that moment, he wished he could rewind, pause, anything to spare this woman. The embarrassment he suddenly realized he might have just helped create. Elaine, meanwhile, felt the weight of his gaze like a tangible pressure on her chest. She had encountered suspicion before, years of rebuilding a professional life after a messy divorce had taught her that, but this felt sharper, more immediate. She straightened the lapels of her blazer, took a breath, and let her voice carry over the hum of the city lights spilling in through floor-to-ceiling windows. "I'm here for the Caldwell briefing," she said, each word deliberate, measured, not loud, but enough that there would be no mistaking her purpose. Michael's eyes narrowed slightly, the frozen moment stretching. He wanted to dismiss it, to treat it as a fluke, a minor misunderstanding. Yet the thought lingered stubbornly. Could he have been wrong? His hand flexed around the glass, ice sliding lazily over the sides, melting into a small pool of water. The symbol was too obvious not to notice his certainty, his authority, slowly dissolving, little by little. Elaine didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that looking away never helped. Instead, she let the tension build just enough to make him uncomfortable, to mirror the quiet fury that coursed beneath her professional composure. She had spent years restoring her dignity after divorce, after layoffs, after colleagues who had dismissed her quietly or openly, and here, in one glance, it was threatened again. Your Brooks Michaels voice finally broke the pause, uncertain, a little too controlled. His tone carried authority. Yes, but it wavered. The pause before he spoke, the brief doubt, lingered longer than he intended. And in that silent hesitation, Elaine could sense the judgment, the assumption, the slight disbelief. Yes, she said, calmly, almost too easily. Her eyes met his without flinching. There was no anger, no dramatics, only quiet insistence, a refusal to allow the moment to define her. And in that, there was a power of its own, a challenge he hadn't expected and didn't entirely know how to handle. He had believed the rumor, even if only for a heartbeat, and now he had to reconcile it with the reality in front of him. Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. His mind raced not with insults, not with strategies, but with the rare and uncomfortable feeling of self-consciousness. He had prided himself on composure, on always reading a room correctly, but Elaine's calm assertion was something he couldn't immediately categorize. He could feel the difference between authority and arrogance, between perception and fact, and he was suddenly painfully aware of how easily the line could blur. She tilted her head slightly, shifting the weight of the laptop bag to her other shoulder. A simple movement, but deliberate. Every gesture seemed to punctuate her point. She was here on her own terms, not as some performance for their amusement. Elaine had fought for this appointment, for this moment, for the chance to prove herself. She wouldn't let a single misperception erase years of effort. Michael finally took a slow, careful step forward, lowering the tumbler onto a nearby side table. The ice rattled gently, a reminder of his own faltering control. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, words measured but faltering slightly at the edges. His gaze lingered, not on the others in the room, but solely on her, and for a second, Elaine considered leaving contract, briefing, all of it. She could walk out and let their assumptions stand unchallenged, but she didn't move. Not yet, not entirely. She exhaled slowly, a sound so quiet that it was almost swallowed by the low hum of the city outside. "Then I suggest we clear it up," she said, not accusing, just stating. Her voice carried the kind of quiet dignity that made him wince, the sharp awareness of someone who knew their own worth and refused to let anyone take it lightly. It was both a statement and a question. Could he step up? Correct what had been assumed? Acknowledge the truth? Michael's throat went dry. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to fix everything instantly, but the right words felt far away. All he could do was stand there, glass in hand, watching the way she held herself, watching the confidence in her stillness, a reflection of what he thought authority looked like, tempered, strong, and just a little wounded. And then she pivoted slightly, as if deciding, as if the world of mistakes and assumptions around her didn't matter anymore. She was ready to walk away, to leave the penthouse and let the misunderstanding linger with them all. The faint click of her heels against the marble sounded like finality. And, in that moment, Michael realized she might actually go. The room seemed to hold its breath with her, and for the first time, he recognized the weight of what his own fleeting assumption could have cost. Not professionally, not financially, but personally, her dignity. "Elaine," he called softly, stepping forward, just enough to stop her, just enough to break her momentum. He hadn't raised his voice, but the sound of her name was threaded with something heavier than courtesy. It carried the acknowledgement of her presence, the recognition of her value, and the first small step toward making right what had almost been lost. Elaine paused mid-step, her hand lightly brushing the doorframe. The tension in her shoulders didn't ease entirely, but the slight halt of her motion gave him a fraction of hope that the conversation might continue not perfectly, not smoothly, but at all. Her gaze lingered on his for a moment, a question unspoken hovering in the space between them. Could she trust him to see her clearly now? And then the penthouse buzzed faintly again, a low murmur of voices from the staff near the bar, as if reminding them both that the world hadn't stopped for this moment. She shifted slightly, a careful, deliberate movement. The question remained, would he let her leave, or would he finally bridge the gap his assumption had created? "Please don't go," he said, and it surprised him more than it surprised her. The words slipped out before he had the chance to second-guess himself, carrying with him a mix of desperation and awkward apology. Elaine paused mid-step, her heel hovering above the marble floor, and turned her head slowly. She hadn't expected him to speak, certainly not with the hesitancy that clung to his voice. The penthouse felt impossibly large in that moment, the glow from the city lights outside casting long reflections on the polished floor, stretching their shadows like the weight of the unspoken between them. Michael Caldwell ran a hand through his dark hair, the gesture almost subconscious, as if trying to rearrange his own thoughts as quickly as he could. The crystal tumbler from earlier sat forgotten on a side table, condensation forming little puddles that mirrored his own uncertainty. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt the sharp prick of guilt cut through his professional composure. He had misjudged her in that one terrible instant, and now he was painfully aware of what his assumption might have cost. Elaine studied him quietly. There was an edge to her posture, a coiled restraint honed from years of having to prove herself, rebuild a life shattered by divorce and layoffs. Her dark eyes, calm but vigilant, tracked his every movement. She wanted this consultancy opportunity, more than she wanted to admit to anyone. Yet the memory of the earlier humiliation pulsed like a small, persistent ember. To work with a man who had, however briefly, seen her through such a distorted lens felt almost unbearable. Yet, here he was, showing something raw, something that hinted at accountability. Michael gestured toward the adjacent conference room, a smaller, quieter space tucked behind the main suite. I think we should talk somewhere private," he said, his voice low, carrying a tone of tentative vulnerability he wasn't accustomed to showing. Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to nod, to comply for the sake of clarity. Yet part of her resisted, but she followed him anyway. The click of her heels soft against the thick carpet that replaced the marble of the main room. Every step felt deliberate, weighted, as if each movement was a negotiation between pride and necessity. Once inside, the room was stark, yet suffused with a soft glow from the overhead lights. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls framed the Chicago skyline, dusted lightly with the early winter snow. Each building was illuminated with a golden shimmer that reflected against the ice-cold glass. The scene should have been calming, cinematic even, but instead it made the tension between them palpable. The city, wide and sprawling, seemed irrelevant compared to the narrowing space of accountability and emotion they now inhabited. Michael let out a low sigh, placing a hand against the glass, feeling its coldness seeping through his palm. "I misjudged you," he began, his words halting, caught somewhere between pride and contrition. "I shouldn't have assumed anything about who you were or why you were here. It was thoughtless. And He stopped abruptly, swallowing, unable to finish the sentence cleanly, the apology too large and awkward to fit neatly into his usual composed diction. Elaine remained silent, arms crossed loosely, the laptop bag now resting on a chair beside her. She wanted to accept the apology, wanted to believe that a man who could acknowledge his mistake so openly might also respect her professionally, but the sting of judgment was still raw, a reminder of vulnerabilities she thought had been sealed years ago. Her mind wrestled with practicality. She needed this work, needed the chance to rebuild and prove her worth, and yet, to do so under the gaze of someone who had already seen her at a perceived low point, someone she might now have to trust, was a delicate, almost unbearable proposition. Michael shifted his weight, rubbing the back of his neck, gaze never leaving hers. The gesture was subtle, human, revealing a side of him few ever saw the man behind the CEO mask. "I know that doesn't erase the first impression," he admitted softly. "But I want to make it right, at least enough that we can start on the right foot. Elaine's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He sounded sincere, too sincere, almost painfully so. The conflict twisted inside her desire for opportunity, battling the instinct to protect her dignity. Years of practice, years of navigating boardrooms and skeptical colleagues had taught her to read sincerity, to gauge the subtleties of remorse. And, in this instance, she could feel the truth behind his awkward phrasing, the self-awareness that made him human, flawed, accountable. A moment of silence stretched between them, long enough for the falling snow outside to blur the bright city lights into a haze of gold and silver. In that pause, Elaine weighed the options, each like a scale tipping slightly under the weight of her own experiences. To walk away would be to protect herself, maintain the fortress she had built over years of disappointment. To stay would be to risk further humiliation, to trust someone who had almost undone her with a misjudgment. And yet, the opportunity, the challenge, and the promise of meaningful work pressed against her practicality. Finally, she exhaled, her shoulders loosening just fractionally. "All right," she said, her tone clipped but measured. "One meeting, that's all. Just one." Her gaze never wavered. Holding his in a careful challenge proved that it's worth it. Michael nodded, a flicker of relief passing across his face, quickly masked by his usual controlled demeanor. "Just one," he echoed, almost as if repeating it aloud would solidify the promise. The brief agreement hung in the room, a fragile bridge built over earlier missteps. Michael gestured toward a small table near the window, offering her a seat, though he remained standing, the posture awkward, protective, apologetic all at once. Elaine sat, hands folded neatly over her laptop bag, eyes scanning the skyline briefly before returning to him. The tension hadn't evaporated. It had merely been reshaped, channeled into a delicate negotiation of trust and professionalism. And then, for the first time, Michael allowed himself to consider something he hadn't before the weight each of them carried into this room. Invisible yet tangible. He could feel the subtle lines of her past, the sharp edges of experience and survival that had brought her here, the quiet fortitude she carried beneath her professional exterior. He realized that his own burdens, the years of loss, the loneliness after his wife's passing, the constant expectation to perform and lead were not unlike hers. They were two adults, carrying separate histories, colliding in a moment of mutual assessment and tentative reconciliation. Elaine, meanwhile, felt the faintest shift in perspective. There was still wariness, still a protective barrier around her ambitions, but she glimpsed the human beneath the polished title, the vulnerability behind the precise movements and careful words. And in that glimpse, she found the tiniest seed of possibility, not romance, not yet, but the potential for respect, for collaboration, for a meeting that might lead to something meaningful despite the rocky start. Outside, the city sprawled indifferent, the snow falling steadily, blanketing the streets and rooftops in quiet anonymity. Inside, the silence between them was thick yet expectant, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Elaine's hands tightened slightly over her laptop bag, a conscious reminder to herself she had not yet agreed to anything beyond this single meeting. Michael's eyes, however, followed hers with an intensity that hinted at recognition, acknowledgement, and perhaps even remorse deeper than he usually allowed himself to feel. Finally, she nodded once, decisively. "I'll stay," she said. The words were brief, restrained, but they carried with them a promise, one meeting, one chance. Michael exhaled audibly, the tension in his shoulders loosening slightly, though his gaze remained fixed on hers, as if trying to read what lay beneath that carefully measured exterior. The room felt charged with unspoken understanding, a fragile truce, and a shared recognition of the unseen burdens they both carried. And as she set her bag aside and prepared to open her laptop, Michael felt it acutely, the silent cost of misjudgment, the subtle consequences of fleeting assumptions, and the tenuous opportunity to earn her trust. The question remained unspoken, hovering in the room like the soft, drifting snow beyond the glass. Could he truly see her now, for who she was, and not for the illusion of his first, fleeting judgment? She had packed her life into 2 cardboard boxes just 3 weeks earlier. The apartment smelled faintly of dust and stale coffee, the sort of scent that seemed to cling to one's skin when everything else had been stripped away. Elaine Brooks stood in the center of the room, staring at the bare floorboards. A folding chair leaned against the wall as the only concession to furniture. A single lamp flickered softly in the corner, its golden glow casting long, lonely shadows across the room. It wasn't much, but it was hers, or at least, hers again. The memory of that last day at the office still cut sharply through her mind. The HR office had been cold, almost sterile, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. She remembered the terse words of the representative, polite yet devoid of empathy. "We're letting you go, effective immediately. Your severance package and paperwork are on the table." Nothing in the office suggested that anyone cared, and Elaine had gathered her belongings with quiet dignity, trying to hold back tears until she reached the elevator. The ride down had felt interminable, each floor a reminder that her career, carefully rebuilt after the divorce, was now crumbling again. Outside, the Chicago wind whipped against her coat as she walked to her car, her laptop bag heavy with more than just technology. It carried her hopes, fears, and memories of years spent trying to prove herself. Her daughter, 17, was living with her ex-husband in Denver. Elaine had agreed it was better for the girl, they said, but the ache in her chest had been relentless. She had driven to Chicago alone, leaving behind a familiar life, friends, and the comfort of routine. Each mile was a mixture of excitement and apprehension, the kind that gnaws quietly at the soul. Chicago promised opportunity, but also isolation. The streets were unfamiliar, the skyline towering and indifferent, and she was left wondering if she had arrived too late, if she had already peaked too early in life, leaving her with nothing but the sharp edges of unmet expectations. Her apartment reflected the fragile state of her world, a solitary lamp, a folding chair, and 2 small boxes containing the essentials she had chosen to bring. Nothing frivolous, nothing sentimental, only what she considered necessary for survival. The silence was thick, almost tangible, as she unpacked methodically, placing each item with care, her hands moving slowly, deliberately. Each movement felt like a negotiation between hope and despair, a small act of defiance against the weight of solitude and the sting of rejection. Elaine sat on the chair finally, folding her hands over her knees, gazing at the empty apartment with a mixture of determination and dread. She knew the path ahead would be difficult. Chicago was no place for half-hearted attempts. The city demanded resilience, ingenuity, and, sometimes, a willingness to fail repeatedly. She felt the weariness seep into her bones, the accumulation of years spent navigating setbacks and disappointments. Yet, somewhere beneath it all, a quiet ember of hope glimmered, an almost imperceptible pulse that whispered she could still reclaim her life. The phone rang suddenly, cutting through the quiet like a sharp inhale. Elaine's heart sank before she even looked at the screen. The caller ID flashed her ex-husband's name. With a deep, reluctant breath, she answered, bracing herself. "Did you find a job yet?" His voice was casual, almost too easy, like a question tossed over a fence, unaware of the weight it carried. Elaine's stomach tightened. She swallowed, forcing a neutral tone. "I have some leads," she said cautiously, careful not to let the strain seep into her voice. The conversation was brief, cordial on the surface, but loaded with the unspoken truth. Her journey to rebuild her career and life was scrutinized from afar, judged silently with each passing day. It was a quiet punch to the gut, a reminder that the world didn't pause for anyone's hardships, that validation often came only from self-determination. After the call ended, Elaine sank further into the chair, the lamplight casting a small halo around her head. She thought about the consultancy position she had applied for, the one that now brought her to Michael Caldwell's office earlier that day. It seemed almost too good to be true, a chance to step into a role where her experience and skill could finally be recognized. But the earlier humiliation lingered, gnawing at her confidence. The question repeated in her mind, soft but insistent, could this be the turning point she had been searching for? Or was it merely another in a series of disappointments? Her eyes wandered to the two boxes, now mostly unpacked. They seemed to hold the fragments of her past life, the memories of a time when things felt simpler. Yet every item was now imbued with the bittersweet knowledge of change and loss. She ran her fingers over the cardboard edge, feeling the rough texture as a grounding sensation. It was a reminder that, while the past could weigh heavily, it also provided the foundation from which she could rebuild. Elaine's gaze drifted toward the window, where snowflakes fell silently against the dark Chicago skyline, each flake unique yet part of a larger, relentless storm, mirrored her own life, a series of individual challenges and setbacks, yet all contributing to the shaping of who she was now. The thought offered no comfort, only clarity. She had survived worse, endured enough to know that persistence was her only option. But survival alone was not enough. She needed an opportunity to thrive, to reclaim the dignity that had been chipped away by layoffs, misunderstandings, and the quiet judgments of those around her. A soft breeze fluttered through the slightly ajar window, carrying the faint smell of winter air into the apartment. It made the lamplight flicker, shadows dancing along the walls. Elaine closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the chill against her face, imagining what it would feel like to step fully into a new life, to allow herself the possibility of success without the constant, gnawing fear of inadequacy. It was a fragile, tentative hope, but hope nonetheless. The phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the consultancy, a reminder tomorrow she would be meeting the team formally. The note was brief, professional, devoid of warmth, yet it was enough to stir something within her. The door to her future was opening, and despite the exhaustion, the loneliness, and the ever-present specter of self-doubt, she felt a flicker of readiness. She would walk through that door, step by deliberate step, even if uncertainty clawed at her from every angle. Elaine rose from the folding chair, stretching slightly, her shadow long against the empty walls. She adjusted the strap of her laptop bag, glanced once more at the packed boxes, and exhaled slowly. Tomorrow held unknowns, promises, and risks, but also the faintest glimmer of something new. She would meet them, confront the possibilities, and see whether this consultancy was the start of the life she had been striving for, or just another reminder that the world refused to pause for anyone's second chance. As she flicked off the lamp and stepped toward the door, the apartment seemed to hold its breath with her, the silence heavy, expectant, waiting to see which way her life would lean. And in that moment, the question lingered, unspoken but unavoidable: would she rise from this fresh start, or falter before the opportunity could fully present itself? "Before you walk away for good," Michael said, his voice low and taut, "there's something you need to see." Elaine froze mid-step, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag as if it could anchor her to reason. She turned slowly, catching the faint flicker of unease in his eyes. It was unusual. Michael Caldwell rarely displayed vulnerability so openly, and that alone made the air between them heavier, more charged. He led her to a glass-walled conference room, the city lights of Chicago bleeding in through the panoramic windows. The skyline shimmered against the darkness, each building a tower of commerce and secrecy, an apt reflection of the situation about to unfold. On the long table lay a stack of papers and a laptop, spreadsheets and printouts that smelled faintly of printer ink and tension. Michael gestured for her to sit, and she did, hesitantly, aware of the thin line between professional obligation and personal discomfort. "This," he said, tapping the spreadsheet, "doesn't add up. Several accounts have discrepancies. The board suspects embezzlement." His gaze was steady but fraught, as if he were seeking absolution through her eyes. Elaine leaned in, adjusting her glasses, the reflection of the spreadsheet lines catching the light and dancing across her lenses. She had seen numbers like this before, patterns hiding in plain sight, subtle anomalies that others overlooked. Her mind, trained and meticulous, began tracing threads almost instinctively. The tension in the room was palpable. Michael's hand hovered near the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening as he watched her scan the figures. Elaine felt the familiar thrill of challenge, the kind that used to keep her awake late into the night when she was rebuilding her career after the divorce. This was the arena she thrived in, yet it was complicated now by proximity to the man whose initial misjudgment had humiliated her. A bitter undercurrent twisted through her satisfaction. Brilliance was intoxicating, but it was never untainted. Minutes passed in near silence, broken only by the soft hum of the city outside and the faint rustle of paper as Elaine moved documents around. Patterns emerged, anomalies coalescing into a troubling shape. She traced transactions across months, noting inconsistencies in accounts that superficially seemed routine. Every observation she made tightened the invisible cord between intellect and peril, each discovery a testament to the sharpness that Michael had perhaps underestimated. The room felt smaller, charged with unspoken acknowledgement of the stakes: corporate ruin or vindication, exposure or concealment. Michael's jaw tightened. He was aware of her gaze, the quiet focus that made her almost impervious to the room's tension. And yet, as much as he trusted her skills, he could not ignore the risk, both professionally and emotionally. Each time she noted a discrepancy, he felt the sting of past assumptions. The memory of the earlier humiliation, mixing uncomfortably with the relief that she was here, analyzing, noticing, solving. He hadn't anticipated the combination of her acuity and calm assertiveness, qualities that had been obscured by his fleeting, mistaken impression of her that very morning. Elaine's mind raced, balancing logic with cautious curiosity. She understood immediately the implications: a hidden account, a series of misdirected transfers, subtle enough to evade typical scrutiny. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the electric thrill of recognition. This was the kind of puzzle she had spent years untangling, and she did it with the precision of someone who had been underestimated far too often. Michael, standing a few feet away, seemed almost fragile in comparison to the commanding clarity she exuded. The irony was not lost on her. Then, as if her intuition had been quietly guiding her hand, she paused over one cell, her finger hovering. A hidden account appeared off the main ledger, omitted in plain sight, almost invisible in its cleverness. Her breath caught. She looked up at Michael, whose expression flickered between awe and apprehension. "I found it," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of both triumph and caution. He exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and tension threading through him. Elaine felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered by wariness. The challenge was exhilarating, but the proximity to Michael Caldwell introduced complications she hadn't accounted for. Working with him promised recognition and engagement, yet the memory of the morning's humiliation, of his brief lapse in judgment, gnawed subtly at her. Could she navigate this professional partnership without reopening wounds she had fought so hard to close? The room seemed to shrink, the city lights a distant glow, as the implications settled around them. Michael's hands rested on the table, unconsciously drawing closer as if to bridge the distance. He had revealed the discrepancy to her because he trusted her insight, yet the fear behind his composed facade was unmistakable. Who else knew? Who else had orchestrated the subtle thefts? And why did he seem almost afraid she would answer that question with unnerving accuracy? The tension between them was palpable. He feared exposure. She feared compromise. And both shared a fragile, unspoken acknowledgement of the stakes. Elaine tapped a key sequence on the laptop, the screen flickering as she traced further anomalies. Each click felt like an assertion of control over chaos, a reclamation of agency in a landscape that had too often rendered her invisible. Yet, with each discovery, the weight of responsibility grew heavier. She was not merely reading numbers. She was uncovering secrets that could topple careers and destabilize the fragile trust within the boardroom. And Michael, watching her every move, carried the silent burden of the fallout that might follow. The discovery of the hidden account reverberated through the quiet room. Elaine leaned back, eyes narrowing as the pieces began to fit together. The thrill of recognition and the tension of potential danger intertwined seamlessly. Michael's brow furrowed, aware that she had not only identified the anomaly, but likely grasped the larger implications, the network of deceit, the subtle misdirections, and the meticulous planning that had masked the theft. Her brilliance, calm and deliberate, commanded the space between them. For a brief moment, they sat in a fragile equilibrium, Elaine's sharp intellect confronting the silent dread in Michael's posture. The city outside moved obliviously on, lights twinkling against the dark, indifferent skyline. But within this room, every glance, every line of code and figure in the spreadsheet carried the weight of discovery, risk, and the unspoken possibility of betrayal. Elaine realized the power she wielded in this moment, the knowledge that she could expose the truth, unravel the mystery, and perhaps redefine her own trajectory and Michael's as well. Yet, as her gaze lifted, meeting his eyes across the glass table, a quiet question lingered between them. Who was responsible for this? And why did Michael appear almost afraid that she would uncover the answer? The implication was heavy, unspoken, the tension thick as Chicago's winter air pressing against the glass. The game had begun, the stakes high, and Elaine understood, with a calm certainty, that her choices in the coming hours could alter far more than spreadsheets. They could reshape trust, power, and perhaps the fragile connection that had begun to form between them. People think CEOs know everything happening under their roof, Michael said softly, almost to himself. They don't. Elaine raised an eyebrow, intrigued, as the room seemed to tilt slightly with the weight of his confession. The glass walls reflected the city lights, but inside the conference room, the glow was warmer, softer, almost intimate, despite the professional setting. For the first time, Michael was not the composed, untouchable CEO. He was a man revealing cracks beneath the surface, cracks that Elaine had not anticipated. He motioned toward a seat, and she sat, careful not to invade his space, but aware of the subtle tension between them. Michael sank into his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose with one hand. His other hand rested on a desk cluttered with papers, a half-empty tumbler of whiskey catching the dim light. There was hesitation in his movements, a restraint that betrayed an inner turmoil few had witnessed. Elaine noted it quietly, her curiosity piqued not just by the financial anomalies, but by the human element that now seemed inseparable from the numbers. "I've been struggling," he admitted, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Since my wife passed, things haven't been the same. The company, I mean. It's been failing in ways I didn't anticipate." His eyes flicked to a frame partially hidden behind stacks of documents. A family photograph slightly turned away. The faint image of him, with his late wife and their young daughter, whispered of a life disrupted, a personal tragedy that had rippled into his professional domain. Elaine's pulse quickened, a mix of empathy and professional curiosity stirring in her chest. Michael leaned back, his gaze distant yet unguarded. "I've always been the one in control, the one people look up to. But admitting I need help, it's harder than anything I've done in business." There was no ego in his voice, only raw truth, and it hit Elaine unexpectedly. The Michael Caldwell she had initially encountered aloof, commanding, sometimes imperious, was giving way to a man confronting fear, uncertainty, and responsibility. She saw in him the same quiet desperation she had felt herself during months of unemployment, navigating life with only her wits and resilience. Elaine's mind, trained to sift facts from emotion, felt the tension between professional duty and human connection. She recognized that this man was entrusting her with more than financial puzzles. He was exposing vulnerability, a silent plea for competence and integrity. Her instincts sharpened, and she leaned slightly forward, her hands brushing the edge of the desk as she absorbed the information. She had entered this room to solve numbers, to correct discrepancies, but now she was negotiating trust, evaluating risk, and weighing the fragile threads of human honesty. The conversation shifted subtly as Michael began outlining the broader issues, revealing not only missing funds, but the culture of fear that had allowed mismanagement to fester. Elaine traced the details, her pen moving almost automatically across her notebook. connecting dots between absentee executives, overlooked accounts, and subtle signs of internal corruption. Yet each insight was layered atop the personal narrative he shared, a widower balancing grief with professional duty, a man protecting a legacy he feared to lose, a human being whose flaws and fears mirrored those she had faced in her own past. Michael paused, running a hand through his hair, and for a moment, the stoic mask slipped entirely. Elaine noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he gestured toward the spreadsheets, the subtle hesitation before he spoke, the way he shifted weight in his chair. These were the signs of someone who carried immense responsibility alone, someone who had learned to internalize stress, to bear burdens quietly. Elaine felt the stirrings of guarded empathy, an acknowledgement that she could navigate this terrain not just with skill, but with careful human consideration. "I can't promise quick fixes," Michael said, his eyes finally meeting hers with an almost pleading intensity. "But if you can help me, if you can work with me, even just for a short time, we might prevent a disaster." The vulnerability in his voice was unmistakable, the unspoken admission that he needed assistance, insight, and someone willing to confront the uncomfortable truths he could not face alone. Elaine considered the offer, weighing the professional opportunity against the emotional risk. She felt the magnetic pull of challenge, the same pull that had drawn her into solving crises before, but tempered by caution. Her gaze fell on the slightly askew family photograph again. The image seemed to summarize the man before her grief: responsibility, resilience, and quiet determination. She realized that stepping into this situation meant engaging with not only the corporate complexities, but the emotional landscape of a man who had endured loss and maintained a fragile empire. Elaine felt a surge of resolve, tempered by awareness of the stakes. This was no ordinary consultancy. It was a delicate negotiation of trust and competence, emotion and intellect intertwined. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady, measured, yet carrying the weight of decision. "I'll stay for 2 weeks," she said. The words hung in the air, both a commitment and a test. Michael exhaled, relief flickering across his features, a slight, almost imperceptible softening of the tension in his shoulders. There was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken agreement that their collaboration would be tested by numbers, strategy, and perhaps by the vulnerabilities they had both exposed. Elaine felt the edge of anticipation, knowing that the coming days would demand her skill, resilience, and emotional acuity in ways she hadn't yet imagined. Yet, even as she settled into the decision, a question lingered, unspoken and heavy in the space between them. Would stepping into this controlled chaos, into someone else's fractured world, be a chance to prove herself or a path to regret? The city lights outside twinkled indifferently, a distant reflection of the uncertainty and possibility that now defined the next chapter of her life. The winter wind whispered against the glass, and Elaine felt the tension of the unknown pressing softly against her determination. She had made a choice, but the cost and the lessons were yet to unfold. Her stomach dropped the moment she recognized the signature. The projection on the large office screen magnified the neat, looping letters until they seemed to taunt her with familiarity. Elaine's hand went instinctively to her chest, pressing against the sudden surge of disbelief and nausea. Richard Hale. The name she hadn't thought of in years. The mentor who had guided her through the early, stumbling steps of her accounting career. He was the man she had trusted implicitly, the one whose advice she had followed without question. And now, staring at the unmistakable handwriting, she felt as if the floor had shifted beneath her. Michael stood beside her, watching her reaction with a mix of concern and professional curiosity. His eyes flicked between her face and the screen, sensing the storm brewing but unable to intervene in the swirl of emotions overtaking her. "Elaine," he asked softly, and she barely heard him. Words from her past collided with the present memories of long hours poring over spreadsheets, late-night discussions in dimly lit offices, advice she had once held sacred, now contaminated by betrayal. Richard had been involved in the hidden transfers, the very embezzlement that could topple the company. Her pulse quickened as confusion, disbelief, and anger warred within her. She stepped back from the projection, almost recoiling. Her vision blurred as the weight of trust violated pressed down. The meticulous lines of numbers, once comforting in their logic, now seemed to mock her with their implications. Richard had been close, almost like family, mentoring her in ways no one else had. How could he have become part of this? How could the one person who had encouraged her to rise, to believe in her own skill, now be responsible for deceit? Her hands trembled, and she gripped the edge of the conference table as though it could anchor her to reality. Michael's voice was calm but firm, cutting through her spiraling thoughts. "Elaine, I know it's hard. I didn't expect it either, but we need to focus on what this means for the company." She didn't hear him entirely. Her mind raced with images of Richard, his easy smile, the way he had patted her shoulder after presenting a report, the advice he'd given about negotiation tactics. Each memory now carried the sting of betrayal, a sharp contrast to the warmth she had once felt. Loyalty and truth collided violently inside her chest. She had believed in him, respected him, perhaps even admired him more than she should have. And yet, there it was in black and white, the signature that betrayed everything. Elaine's chest tightened as a wave of helpless rage washed over her. She wanted to scream, to confront Richard, to demand answers. But the man in question was no longer present, only his ghostly imprint on financial records. The room seemed suddenly smaller, the walls closing in with every detail she reviewed. She could feel Michael's eyes on her, waiting for her to respond. And yet, she couldn't. Not now. She needed space, distance, air. Her career had been a series of battles fought with diligence and careful calculation, but this felt personal. This was a wound not just to her professional life, but to the part of herself that trusted, that believed in people. The cinematic reflection of the Chicago skyline through the glass walls offered no solace. The city lights blinked mockingly, indifferent to her personal heartbreak. She thought of her move to Chicago, the effort it had taken to rebuild her life after her layoff, to step into a new city and claim competence as her own. And now, this betrayal threatened to undo the fragile sense of accomplishment she had carefully cultivated. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms, as she forced herself to take a deep breath. The logic she prized in her work battled against the emotional turmoil clawing at her consciousness. Without a word, Elaine pivoted and walked toward the door. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing her sense of displacement. She didn't need to explain herself. The betrayal was sufficient. Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes. Unbidden, but undeniable, she felt the weight of all she had lost, not only the trust in Richard, but also a piece of the innocence that had allowed her to believe in mentorship and guidance. This was different from a corporate mistake. This was personal. It cut deeper than spreadsheets, contracts, or boardroom politics ever could. Michael took a tentative step after her. "Elaine, wait." But she didn't stop. Her vision blurred further, focusing only on the path away from the office and the figure of the man whose betrayal was etched into her memory. Each step was both escape and confrontation, an acknowledgement that she could not face this calmly in the present. The emotional crescendo of shock and pain pressed her forward. The betrayal was a knife in her gut, twisting not just through professional pride, but through the fragile trust she had given so freely in the past. As she reached the threshold of the office, Elaine paused, her hand on the handle, shoulders trembling. She turned her head briefly, catching Michael's gaze, an expression of silent concern mixed with regret, but she could not yet meet it. Her mind replayed Richard's signature over and over. Each loop on the projection screen burned into her memory. She felt the full magnitude of the treachery and the personal connection violated. The office, the city skyline, the soft hum of fluorescent lights all became background to the raw, unprocessed emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps as she stepped into the corridor, distancing herself physically and mentally from the scene. The door closed behind her with a soft click, a final separation from the evidence of betrayal. Her vision cleared slightly, but the ache in her chest remained, pulsating with the unanswered questions and the gnawing sense of being blindsided. She realized that nothing in her career had prepared her for this. Not spreadsheets, not audits, not the meticulous review of numbers. This was human failure, personal and painful, and she had to navigate it alone, at least for now. Would Michael follow her, reaching out across the tension, or would he let her go, giving her the space she demanded while risking losing the crucial insight she could provide? That unanswered question lingered, heavy in the corridor's silence, a hook for the next move, a pulse of suspense in the stillness of the night. The cold air hit her first. The warmth of his footsteps came next, hesitant but deliberate, crunching against the thin layer of frost on the parking lot asphalt. Elaine sat hunched over the steering wheel, hands gripping it so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. She hadn't realized how badly she was trembling until she felt the car door open, a shadow stretching across the dashboard. Michael crouched beside the window, his eyes meeting hers with that mixture of concern and unspoken apology that had been his constant lately. "I didn't mean to," he started, then faltered. His voice softened, blending with the hum of distant traffic and the occasional squeak of tires. Elaine didn't answer, just stared at him, the familiar storm of hurt, betrayal, and disbelief still boiling under her chest. She could feel the pulse of her heartbeat as she realized the truth she had been carrying this alone. And now, someone else, someone who had humiliated her, was sharing pieces of his own fractured past. The thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Michael's hands were in his pockets, his posture uncharacteristically open. "Elaine, I've had my share of people I trusted, who turned out to be less than honest. I've lost partners, friends, people I thought I knew. I know it doesn't excuse what happened here," he said, each word deliberate, carrying weight. "But I also know that sometimes understanding someone else's struggle can help you face your own." He paused, eyes flicking to the shadows of the lot, then back to her. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to move forward. Together." Elaine swallowed, the lump in her throat making it hard to speak. His words, simple and steady, grounded her. There was no pretense, no corporate veneer, only the raw sincerity of a man who had been tested and found himself still standing, albeit bruised. Her chest tightened with a cautious hope she had not allowed herself in years. She could almost hear her own pulse, a slow rhythm syncing with his, reminding her that they were both human, flawed but capable of resilience. She drew in a shuddering breath, exhaling slowly, letting the chill of the winter evening contrast with the warmth she felt rising from the small, shared space between them. The flickering streetlight above cast shadows across Michael's face, softening the harsh lines of stress and responsibility. He had aged in the last few years, the grief of his wife's death etched into his features, yet there was a steadiness in him now that Elaine hadn't noticed before. This man, the CEO, the one who had unknowingly humiliated her, was also someone who could sit beside her in the cold and share the weight of his own scars. "You make it sound easier than it is," she murmured, voice barely above the whisper of the wind. Her hands still gripped the wheel, knuckles white, but she was no longer trembling uncontrollably. She wanted to recoil, to protect herself, but something in his gaze anchored her. "I've learned the hard way, that trusting can cost you more than you think." Her tone was cautious, defensive, yet laced with honesty she hadn't expected to voice aloud. Michael nodded, understanding the guarded boundary she was placing between them. "I know, and I won't ask you to ignore the cost. But maybe we don't have to face it alone. Maybe two people who've been hurt can face the world together, with eyes wide open." He tilted his head slightly, a silent question hanging in the cold night. His breath mingled with hers in the frigid air, a visible thread of connection, fragile yet undeniable. Elaine's mind raced. Could she trust him? Could she risk opening herself to someone who had already occupied a complicated space in her professional and emotional world? The temptation to retreat, to close the car door, and lock herself away from the possibility of further disappointment, warred with the tentative pull of understanding and kinship. Here was a man carrying his own invisible burdens, someone who had endured loss, someone human beneath the title and authority. She felt seen, and that recognition was both terrifying and magnetic. The sound of the city beyond the parking lot was muted, as if the world had contracted to the two of them and the fragile, trembling space they shared. Elaine felt her defenses softening, the tight coil of resentment and fear unraveling slowly. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a sliver of connection, of hope that perhaps this partnership, this unlikely alliance, could be more than just a professional arrangement. Her heart raced, cautious yet willing, aware of the risks but drawn by something intangible, a shared understanding of pain, resilience, and the possibility of redemption. Michael's voice broke through the quiet hum. "Will you let me stand with you in this?" The question hovered between them, simple, unassuming, yet weighty with implication. It was not an offer of control or a demand, but a hand extended, a bridge across mutual scars. Elaine's breath hitched, her thoughts spinning in a mixture of hope and fear. Could she? Should she? The answer was not immediate. She wanted to, in a small, quiet way, but the scars were still tender, the wounds raw, and the memory of betrayal lingered like frostbite. A shiver ran through her, partly from the cold, partly from the intensity of the moment. She looked into his eyes, searching for the familiar corporate mask, and found none. Just a man, flawed, human, offering sincerity and partnership. Her mind flickered between retreat and reach, between instinctive caution and the slow warmth of tentative trust. The parking lot, the flickering streetlight, the breath mingling in the cold, all became a small stage where two people could meet as equals, carrying their histories without pretension. Elaine's hands unclenched the steering wheel slightly, a signal to herself that perhaps, just perhaps, she could allow this fragile connection to exist. The future remained uncertain, the questions unspoken, the fear of disappointment still palpable. But for now, under the cold Chicago night sky, there was a shared recognition, a tentative bridge formed between two adults who had weathered storms separately and now found themselves in the same storm together. Would she trust him enough to walk through this storm side by side? Could she allow the possibility of support without losing herself? The night held its breath, waiting for her answer, leaving the space between them taut with potential and unspoken questions. As fragile and flickering as the streetlight above, they didn't plan to become a team, but numbers don't lie, and neither does quiet understanding. Elaine adjusted her glasses, eyes scanning the spreadsheet projected onto the conference room wall. The lines of figures, at first indecipherable to anyone not trained in forensic accounting, seemed to leap off the page for her. Each irregularity, each suspicious transaction whispered a story only she could read. Michael hovered nearby, leaning against the edge of the table, his brow furrowed as he watched her work. The subtle tilt of his head, the way he softened his features when she explained her logic, it all unsettled her, in ways unrelated to the financial investigation. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee, mingling with the crisp scent of printed documents. Two mugs sat at the edge of the table, steam curling lazily from their rims. Elaine poured herself another sip, mindful of the way the warm liquid steadied her nerves. Michael reached for his own, fingers brushing hers. A spark, unexpected and sharp, traveled up her arm. Neither of them pulled back. The silence stretched, filled with a tension that had nothing to do with the numbers and everything to do with the unspoken chemistry between them. Elaine forced herself to concentrate on the screen, repeating the formulas in her mind, but her heart had noticed a rhythm she could not ignore. Hours passed as they worked side by side, tracing digital footprints, cross-referencing bank statements, and constructing a timeline of the fraud. Conversation shifted from strictly professional observations to quieter, more personal admissions. Michael recounted a misstep early in his career, the regret still faintly audible in his measured voice. Elaine, hesitating at first, shared a small victory from her past, a challenge she had overcome that no one had celebrated with her. In these moments, the room felt smaller, warmer, insulated from the world outside, as if the cityscape visible through the wide office windows were a painting, distant and unthreatening. Elaine caught herself stealing glances at him, noting the subtle tensions in his shoulders and the way his eyes lingered on the spreadsheets. Not out of boredom, but concentration. She remembered how she had once assumed all CEOs were untouchable, impervious to error or emotion. Here was a man who bore the weight of responsibility, who had experienced personal loss, yet was willing to trust her with the delicate intricacies of his company's finances. The thought unsettled her, tugging at emotions she had long convinced herself were dormant: hope, excitement, and an unmistakable pull toward the possibility of something more than professional respect. Their discussions grew more fluid, each suggestion met with nods and subtle affirmations, sometimes a shared smile when they uncovered a particularly clever misdirection in the accounts. The lines of figures became less abstract, transforming into a puzzle they solved together. There was a rhythm to their collaboration, a quiet dance of intellects, their hands occasionally brushing over the papers, a fleeting connection neither of them acknowledged aloud. It was exhilarating and terrifying, a reminder that boundaries could blur when the heart followed the mind too closely. Elaine leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Michael reached for a stack of invoices, pausing to glance at her. "You're incredible at this," he said softly, as if the words were more for himself than her. The sincerity in his voice, devoid of flattery or expectation, disarmed her. She wanted to retreat into her professional armor, to remind herself of the humiliations of the past, but the warmth in her chest urged her to lean in, to allow herself to notice, to feel. Minutes later, they discovered an anomaly buried deep within the ledgers, a series of transfers masked by layers of legitimate transactions. Elaine's eyes widened as she highlighted the entries, showing Michael the trail. He leaned over, shoulders brushing hers, and in that small moment, her hand grazed his again. Neither flinched. The brief contact sent a pulse through her, awareness sharpening every sensation, every word exchanged. She realized with a jolt that the line between professional collaboration and something more intimate was thinner than she had expected. The day wore on, the office lights casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the early evening brought a dim gray twilight, reflecting in the sleek glass surfaces around them. The city hummed faintly in the distance, irrelevant compared to the quiet intensity between them. Elaine felt a mix of exhilaration and fear, exhilaration at uncovering the truth, at engaging with someone who challenged her intellectually and emotionally, and fear of what acknowledging these feelings might mean. Michael, seemingly oblivious to the charge between them, maintained focus, yet his eyes lingered a fraction too long on her face whenever she spoke. Elaine shook herself slightly, trying to refocus on the task. "We need to trace this back further," she said, her voice firm but betraying the faintest tremor of distraction. Michael nodded, handing her a folder, fingers brushing again. A subtle smile passed between them, unspoken acknowledgement of the shared tension that had taken root. Each brush of skin, each shared glance, each laugh at a minor error in the spreadsheets deepened the unspoken bond. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. Hours melted away. The room grew darker, the remaining light from the city casting angular reflections across their work. Elaine felt herself growing weary, but not tired in the conventional sense. She felt alive in a way that was both invigorating and precarious. Her mind and heart were engaged, dancing on the edge of caution and curiosity. She recognized the dangerous chemistry simmering just beneath the surface. She had been careful for so long, protecting herself from disappointment and humiliation. Yet here it was, the slow, insistent pull of trust, admiration, and attraction coalescing in a space meant for professionalism. Finally, Elaine stood to stretch, feeling the ache in her back and shoulders. Michael followed, and their hands brushed once more as they reached for a folder at the same time. They both froze, then glanced at each other, eyes wide with unspoken recognition. Neither withdrew, the electricity lingering in the moment, fragile and exhilarating. Elaine looked away first, pretending to organize the papers, but her chest remained tight, her mind unwilling to dismiss the significance of the contact. The day had changed everything, even if only in subtle increments. As she gathered her coat and bag, she realized she didn't want this day to end, not because of the work alone, but because of him, because of what they had begun to discover, not just in the numbers, but in each other. The quiet bond was there, undeniable, and it both thrilled and terrified her. She stepped into the cool night air, heart racing, mind alight with questions she wasn't ready to answer. Was it possible to trust him, to let someone see past the professional veneer to the vulnerable, living person beneath? The answer was not yet hers to give, leaving her with a mix of anticipation, fear, and something dangerously like hope. Was this becoming more than work? Elaine couldn't decide. Yet the question clung to her as she closed the office door behind her, leaving Michael still standing among the scattered documents and fading city light. The email arrived at 2:14 a.m. One sentence. One warning. Elaine stared at her phone, the blue light harsh against the darkness of her apartment. Her breath caught, each word etched into her mind with a weight that made her chest tighten. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. She set the phone down on the small kitchen counter, the glow illuminating the empty room around her, the single lamp casting long shadows across bare walls. A folding chair tucked awkwardly into the corner. The apartment, usually a safe haven from the chaos of the day, now felt like a trap, closing in with every passing second. Her fingers trembled slightly as she replayed the morning's work in her head. The discoveries she and Michael had made, the hidden accounts, the subtle manipulations in the ledgers they had started peeling back layers of deceit no one outside the company should know. And now, someone knew that she knew. Someone was watching. Elaine had faced challenges before: painful divorces, financial uncertainty, moving to a new city, but nothing had prepared her for a direct threat like this. It was intimate, invasive, and terrifying. She walked over to the window, looking out over the dark Chicago streets, her breath fogging the glass. In the silence, she could almost hear the faint hum of the city, a distant reminder that life continued beyond her walls. But the hum did little to calm the storm in her mind. Who could it be? Someone in the finance department, a trusted executive. The thought that the danger came from inside her workplace made her skin crawl. Every friendly smile in the office, every casual comment from colleagues, now felt laced with suspicion. Elaine considered quitting. She thought about walking away from the investigation entirely, retreating to a life of safety and anonymity. But the notion felt hollow, like betraying her own sense of self. She had spent years reclaiming her dignity, building a career on her competence and integrity. To run now, at the first sign of threat, would be a concession she could never forgive herself for. And yet, the fear remained, each second stretched, echoing in the quiet of the apartment, making her pulse pound in her ears. Her phone vibrated again, a soft reminder that the message lingered in her notifications. Elaine's hands hovered over the device, unsure whether to respond, delete, or ignore. The words felt alive, a subtle poison crawling into her thoughts. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. What did they mean by regret? Was it her reputation, her career, her safety? The ambiguity gnawed at her. She had never felt so simultaneously small and exposed, yet oddly alert, every nerve ending alive to the potential danger around her. The sound of a knock at the door startled her, heart lurching. She froze, every muscle tense, as another knock followed, more insistent this time. Peering through the peephole, relief collided with surprise. Michael stood there, coat collar raised against the cold, eyes wide with concern. "Elaine, are you okay?" His voice was low, careful, but carried an urgency that mirrored her own fear. She hesitated, glancing back at her glowing phone, the message still on the screen. It's nothing," she began, though her voice betrayed the uncertainty she felt. Michael didn't accept the dismissal. Instead, He stepped closer, protective yet restrained. "I saw the alert in your system tonight," he said. "I know you've been working late, and I know something's wrong. Talk to me." His presence brought a paradoxical comfort, the knowledge that someone else was watching out for her, counterbalanced by the tension of her vulnerability. Elaine led him inside, trying to maintain composure. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the shadows heavier, and the blue glow of her phone like a sentinel keeping watch. Michael's eyes scanned the room, noticing the sparse furnishings, the signs of recent upheaval, and the small traces of her solitary life. "You don't have to face this alone," he said quietly. There was an earnestness in his tone, the kind that demanded trust but offered no guarantees. She explained the message, her voice steadier now, recounting the sequence of discoveries that had led to the anonymous warning. Michael listened, absorbing every word, his expression unreadable for a moment before tightening in resolve. "Someone inside doesn't want this uncovered," he said finally, "and they're watching, but they underestimated you, and me." His confidence, calm but firm, offered a lifeline she wasn't sure she deserved, but needed nonetheless. Elaine felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of fear and the strange, unfamiliar trust she placed in him. She had learned to rely only on herself, to shield her heart and intellect alike. And yet, here he was, standing in her small, vulnerable space, offering a partnership forged in necessity and understanding. Could she accept it without losing the independence she cherished? The question lingered, heavy, as the two of them moved toward the kitchen table, planning their next steps, tracing potential threats and plotting contingencies. Minutes ticked by, filled with whispered strategizing, the soft clatter of laptops, and the occasional pause when either of them considered the implications of the unknown enemy. Elaine's mind raced, weighing options, recalculating risk, measuring the urgency against her own need for safety. Michael's presence anchored her, a counterbalance to the fear that sought to pull her under. They formed a silent understanding the investigation would continue, but cautiously, intelligently, aware that every move might provoke the unknown adversary further. At 3 a.m. The apartment was bathed in the cold glow of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. Elaine sat back, fatigue pressing against her consciousness. Yet she couldn't rest entirely. Michael watched her for a moment before speaking again, his voice soft but unwavering. "We'll face this together," he said. And though she knew danger was far from over, that the saboteur could strike again at any moment, Elaine felt a tiny spark of courage ignite within her. The storm outside her door hadn't abated, but with him, perhaps she could weather it. She glanced at the phone again, the warning still on the screen, and shivered. But for the first time since the message arrived, she considered staying, not running. Michael's reassurance anchored her, fragile, cautious, but undeniably real. The question remained, as pressing as the threat itself. How far would the saboteur go? And was she prepared to face whatever came next? He didn't mean to say it, but exhaustion has a way of revealing the truth. The diner was nearly empty, the hum of the neon sign outside casting a soft pink glow across the vinyl booths. Elaine stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, the warmth of the cup contrasting with the chill lingering from the evening. Across from her, Michael rubbed the bridge of his nose, eyes tired but unflinching, as if he were trying to weigh every word before it escaped. Yet, some words had a way of slipping out before reason could intervene. I admire you, Elaine," he said finally, his voice low, carrying both hesitation and sincerity. "Not just for the work, for how you handle everything, and how you carry yourself." The words were unexpected, sudden, yet somehow gentle, like a hand reaching out through the fog of uncertainty. Elaine's heart jumped, and for a brief moment, the numbers and spreadsheets and financial anomalies that had consumed their week faded into the background. Her pulse accelerated, a mix of flustered surprise and a hint of fear she hadn't felt in years. She looked down at her coffee, clenching the cup tighter than necessary. Admiration from a colleague or anyone was one thing. Admiration from Michael Caldwell, the man who had witnessed her confidence under scrutiny, Her competence in a high-pressure environment stirred something raw and vulnerable inside her. She reminded herself of the times she had trusted, only to be let down. The walls she'd carefully built over the past decade didn't fall easily. I appreciate that," she said, keeping her tone neutral, letting the words sound polite, almost rehearsed. But inside, her thoughts whirled. Admiration was different from connection. This was dangerous territory. She had seen men in positions of power mistake competence for flirtation, and she refused to be the temporary solace for someone else's loneliness, especially someone like Michael, who carried the weight of his company and the scars of personal loss. It wasn't just a professional entanglement. It could be an emotional minefield. Michael's gaze softened as he watched her, sensing her retreat without pushing. He understood, or at least tried to. He had learned the hard way that patience was sometimes more potent than persuasion. The diner's lights flickered faintly, and a car passed outside, casting fleeting shadows that danced across Elaine's face, highlighting the worry lines she tried to hide. "I didn't mean to complicate things," he said, almost apologetically. I think it's important, you know." Elaine's chest tightened. She wanted to leave. She wanted to escape the intensity that had crept into the space between them like an invisible thread, pulling her forward while warning her to stay back. She had survived heartbreak before, had rebuilt her life one careful step at a time. Letting herself become entangled with Michael, letting emotions surface so close to fragile beginnings, felt reckless. And yet, a small part of her longed to lean in, to see if perhaps he could be different from everyone else. Her mind raced back to the early days in Chicago, the empty apartment, the cardboard boxes, the loneliness that had weighed heavier than any corporate failure. She remembered the sleepless nights analyzing ledgers, the constant pressure to prove herself, and the quiet ache of wanting more from life than mere survival. Michael's words, gentle and sincere, touched on that longing, stirring a mixture of hope and fear. She wanted to believe in trust, in partnership, in something beyond the spreadsheets and late nights, but caution held her firmly in its grasp. Elaine pushed back slightly in the booth, her body language closing off the subtle connection. "I need to focus on the work," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Her hands trembled just enough to betray the composure she tried to maintain. "That's why I'm here. Not this." The unspokenness hung in the air, heavy with implication. Michael nodded, understanding the boundaries she had set, though it pained him to accept them so abruptly. The moment stretched, filled with quiet tension and the faint smell of coffee, vinyl, and the cold air that had followed her from the parking lot. Elaine felt a swell of conflicting emotions, curiosity, longing, and the persistent echo of old wounds that warned her not to give in too quickly. Her mind raced through the scenarios, the possible consequences of letting herself relax. Even for a moment, Michael's presence was comforting, undeniably so, yet also a potential source of new vulnerability she hadn't planned to entertain. Finally, unable to bear the intensity of the space, Elaine stood abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor, echoing in the quiet diner. Michael looked up, startled by the sudden movement, but he said nothing, allowing her the dignity of her retreat. She clutched her coat around her, the neon light painting her in shades of soft pink and shadow, her mind spinning, the desire to protect herself, to maintain control over her emotions, clashed violently with the ache of connection that had quietly ignited. It was a reminder that even strength had limits and that trust, once fractured, demanded careful rebuilding. Elaine left the diner without looking back, the cold night air hitting her face with a sharp clarity. Her steps were brisk, purposeful, yet her heart betrayed the rhythm of her determination. She couldn't allow herself to dwell on Michael's confession. Not now. She had work to finish, responsibilities that could not wait. And yet, as she moved through the quiet streets of Chicago, the neon glow of the diner fading behind her, the words lingered, echoing softly admiration, sincerity, connection. They left an indelible mark, one she could neither ignore nor immediately act upon. Her apartment was dark and empty, the quiet pressing against her ears. She set her keys down on the counter, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the black screen of her phone. The diner. Michael's words. The soft pink glow, all of it hovered in her mind like a fragile ghost. Elaine knew that the choices she made in the coming days would not just affect the investigation, but her heart as well. And for the first time in a long while, she felt the tension between what she wanted and what she allowed herself to feel sharp, electric, and unresolved. She walked into the boardroom with the kind of calm that scared powerful men. The polished mahogany table reflected the fluorescent lights above, but it couldn't reflect the fire in Elaine's eyes. Every step she took was deliberate, measured, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, echoing through the hushed room. All around her, executives and board members stirred uneasily, sensing a tension thicker than any quarterly report. At the far end, Richard Hale adjusted his tie, attempting to mask his surprise, but the slight twitch in his jaw betrayed him. He hadn't expected her to walk in alone, prepared, confident. Elaine's gaze swept the room, landing on Michael. He stood near the entrance, his tall frame relaxed yet alert, a silent anchor beside her. His eyes met hers briefly, conveying reassurance without stepping in to shield her. She didn't need saving. She needed acknowledgement that she wasn't alone in her pursuit of truth. Every paper, every file she'd meticulously analyzed over the past weeks rested in her leather briefcase, an arsenal of incontrovertible evidence. She placed it gently on the table, letting the weight of it announce itself. The room fell silent. "Mr. Hale," she began, her voice steady but sharp, carrying authority that only comes from clarity of purpose. "We've reviewed the financial discrepancies, the transfers you authorized, the accounts you attempted to hide, they're all here." She laid out the documents with precision, letting the inked numbers and signatures speak for themselves. Richard's face paled as he leaned forward, scanning the pages he once believed were beyond scrutiny. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence pressed heavier than any confrontation he had faced in decades. Elaine's pulse raced beneath the composed exterior. This wasn't just about numbers or corporate accountability. It was about reclaiming a piece of herself that had been quietly battered over years of compromise and misplaced trust. She remembered the mentor she had once revered, the man who had shaped her early career, the lessons that felt like a lifetime ago. Letting go of that illusion was harder than facing the fraud itself. Yet, as her eyes met Richard's, she felt clarity crystallize. This was no longer about personal disappointment. It was about justice. Michael stepped forward, not to interject, but to provide silent support. His presence was steady, an unspoken partnership that didn't need words. Elaine noticed how his hand hovered near the edge of the table, a subtle acknowledgement of solidarity. She drew strength from it, recognizing that confronting this corruption didn't make her weak, it made her resolute. The executives around the table shifted uneasily, murmuring among themselves, aware that history was being rewritten in that room. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through the documents, trying in vain to find an escape. Elaine's eyes never wavered, and she felt the righteous anger rise steadily, tempered by intellect and experience. She had spent weeks piecing together the puzzle, late nights fueled by determination and coffee, unraveling a betrayal that cut deeper than any spreadsheet could quantify. The room held its breath as she laid down the final piece, a transfer that linked directly to his offshore accounts. Undeniable and incriminating. A quiet tear slid down her cheek as she signed her testimony. It was a subtle act, almost imperceptible to those around her, but heavy with significance. That single tear captured years of disappointment, resilience, and the refusal to allow deceit to define her. She wasn't crying for Richard. She was crying for herself, for the integrity she fought to reclaim, for the dignity that had been questioned too many times. The tear reflected the soft overhead lights, a solitary prism of resolve in the corporate sterility. Michael's gaze met hers once more, brief and unwavering. He didn't need to say a word. Elaine felt an unspoken acknowledgement she had done this on her own terms. The board, after a tense exchange of glances, moved decisively. The decision to press charges was unanimous, swift, and resolute. Richard's protests fell flat, drowned out by the meticulous evidence she had presented. Power shifted subtly, from deception to accountability, and Elaine felt a rush of vindication tempered by reflection. She leaned back slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle. The adrenaline ebbed, replaced by a quiet clarity. This confrontation, though necessary, didn't define her future. It was merely the first act of reclaiming it. The choices ahead stretched out like the city skyline, beyond the conference room windows, vast and filled with potential. She had faced betrayal, reclaimed her integrity, and demonstrated strength not through aggression, but through precision and moral certainty. Elaine gathered her papers, feeling the textures under her fingertips, each page a testament to diligence, to standing firm against wrongdoing. Michael remained a silent observer, yet his presence reminded her that partnership, professional or otherwise, could be built on respect and trust. The room gradually returned to normalcy, the tension dissipating, but Elaine felt the lingering charge of empowerment. She had confronted the past, dismantled deception, and yet a question remained. What would she choose for herself now? With the board's decision in motion and Richard's influence neutralized, the future was hers to shape. Freedom, choice, and possibility awaited. But so did uncertainty. She could step back into her career, redefine her life, or allow herself to explore connections she had long avoided. The boardroom, once a place of intimidation and power games, had become a crucible for self-realization. Elaine's heart beat with the thrill of victory and the quiet apprehension of the unknown. She turned to Michael, letting her eyes linger on his calm, steady presence. There was gratitude, unspoken understanding, and an awareness that they had navigated this storm together, though each on their own terms. Elaine knew the decisions to come, personal, professional, and emotional, would shape the next chapter of her life. But for now, she allowed herself a small, private triumph. She had chosen integrity over history, truth over comfort, and strength over fear. She didn't knock. She just walked in like someone who finally knew her place in the world. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, pooling in golden rectangles across the conference table. Dust motes floated lazily in the warm light, catching on the edges of papers, pens, and the faint trace of yesterday's coffee rings. Elaine paused at the doorway for a single, deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had led her here, the betrayals, the sleepless nights, the near misses, and the victories that had left her bruised but unbroken. Michael looked up from his laptop, a hint of surprise crossing his tired features. His eyes softened when they met hers, the kind of warmth that had always been tempered by restraint but never absent. "You're early," he said quietly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. There was no teasing, no corporate bravado, just him, stripped down to the human beneath the CEO title. "I'm ready," she said simply. The words carried more weight than any memo or presentation could. It wasn't about proving herself anymore. It was about completing what she had started. The office felt different in the morning light, less intimidating, less suffocating. Perhaps it had always been her own expectations that made it heavy. Now, walking in, she felt space to breathe, to choose. Michael gestured to the chair across from him, but Elaine ignored it, setting her briefcase on the table instead. The documents she'd organized meticulously the night before sat ready. Every spreadsheet, every note a testament to her focus, her skill, and her resilience. As she pulled up a chair beside him, their hands brushed over the leather tabletop, the subtle contact sending a quiet thrill through her. She tried not to notice, focusing instead on the task at hand. But it lingered, a whisper of possibility. "We've got a lot to finish," she said, tapping a few keys and opening the first file. Her eyes scanned the figures with the kind of precision that came from years of experience, months of intense focus, and countless moments when she'd thought she'd never feel capable again. Michael watched, leaning slightly closer, his gaze both evaluative and supportive. The air between them was warm, electric with unspoken acknowledgement, Two people who had found a rhythm through shared purpose, tension, and trust. As they worked side by side, the hours passed almost unnoticed. Occasionally, their eyes met over the rows of numbers, exchanging a glance that said more than words ever could. There was laughter too, soft and infrequent, breaking the monotony of audit work, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, connection could be found. Elaine felt a healing settling over her, a slow but undeniable warmth creeping into her chest, comforting and tentative. The past wasn't erased, but it no longer dictated her every move. By mid-afternoon, the last files were cross-checked, the discrepancies documented, and the report ready for submission. Elaine leaned back, letting out a long exhale. Michael's expression mirrored her relief, a subtle smile tugging at his lips as he closed his laptop. The office felt lighter, imbued with the kind of quiet triumph that comes from facing difficult truths and emerging with integrity intact. For a moment, neither spoke, both aware of the shared journey they had just navigated together. Then Michael reached for the conference room door, pausing as he looked at her. "Elaine," he said, his voice low and steady, "I want you to stay, permanently, as my partner, equal." The words were simple, but the gravity behind them was immense. She could feel the sincerity, the trust, and the respect embedded in the offer. This wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, validation, and an invitation to step fully into a new chapter. Elaine's fingers hovered over the tabletop, tracing the edge of the sunlight pooling across the polished wood. Her heart raced, caught between instinctive caution and the pull of hope. She had been careful for so long, shielding herself from disappointment, from betrayal, from expectations that never aligned with reality. Yet here, in this quiet moment, with the golden light reflecting off Michael's thoughtful expression, she felt the possibility of something genuine, something real, something she could claim as her own. The mini-climax arrived in a simple gesture. Michael extended his hand across the table, a deliberate, patient offering. Elaine hesitated for just a heartbeat, feeling the weight of every choice she had made, every risk she had taken, every wall she had built around her heart. Then, slowly, decisively, she took his hand. The contact was firm, warm, and grounding. It was both professional and profoundly personal, a bridge between the worlds they had carefully navigated and the one they might explore together. A gentle smile touched her lips, and Michael's mirrored hers. The room seemed to exhale with them, the sunlight brightening the corners, the shadows retreating. Papers and documents lay forgotten for a moment. The hard work completed, the path forward illuminated by mutual respect and a quiet thrill of connection. The city hummed beyond the glass walls, indifferent yet inviting, filled with possibilities as vast as the skyline that stretched toward the horizon. And yet, even as she sat there, holding his hand, a small, persistent question lingered beneath the surface. Was this just the beginning of a professional partnership strengthened by trust? Or had something deeper begun to take root, something she hadn't dared to believe possible until now? The warmth between them was undeniable, and as the sunlight continued to pool across the table, Elaine felt the first tentative stirrings of hope and possibility. It was a new beginning, uncharted and bright, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel afraid. They didn't call it a date, but the way they walked told another story. The sun was dipping low over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold, reflecting across the water like molten metal. The promenade was mostly empty, save for a few joggers and the occasional couple wrapped in blankets against the evening chill. Elaine pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, more out of habit than cold, and glanced sideways at Michael. He walked beside her with a quiet attentiveness, eyes forward but alert to her every small gesture. "I never properly apologized," Michael said softly, his voice carrying in the gentle wind. "For the first day, everything. I shouldn't have let them speak like that, and I shouldn't have frozen." His gaze flicked toward hers, earnest and slightly vulnerable. Elaine felt a familiar warmth in her chest, one that had been buried beneath layers of mistrust and caution. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge that day the humiliation that had stung more than any boardroom rejection or career setback. Yet here he was, carrying the weight of it himself. Elaine's fingers twitched, almost subconsciously, as she walked, considering whether to say something, anything. Words felt inadequate. Instead, she let a small nod communicate that she had heard him. Sometimes, acknowledgement mattered more than grand declarations. Her heart, which had grown protective after years of careful guarding, fluttered with cautious hope. The city hummed faintly behind them, the soft lapping of water against the shore echoing their steady steps. They fell into an easy rhythm, neither rushing nor lingering unnecessarily. Michael pointed out the light reflecting off a cluster of sailboats, their sails catching the sunset like paper caught in a fire. Elaine laughed softly, the sound lighter than it had been in weeks, and she caught him smiling back at her, not the corporate smile reserved for subordinates or colleagues, but something entirely human, something warm. It struck her then how far they'd come, from that awkward, humiliating first encounter to this quiet, shared space of trust. She stole a glance at him, taking in the slight crease at the corners of his eyes, the gentle set of his jaw, the way his hand flexed occasionally as if fighting against nervous energy. He had scars, too, ones that weren't obvious on the surface losses, betrayals, moments when pride had been his only armor. Seeing them alongside her own, she realized for the first time how similar they were, two adults shaped by mistakes, by resilience, and by the stubborn desire to keep moving forward. Michael slowed his pace and gestured toward the water. "Look at that," he said, voice soft, almost reverent. The lake shimmered under the fading sun, ripples distorting their reflections. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though they were walking on the edge of a dream, side by side. Both figures wavered but inseparable in the mirrored water. Elaine allowed herself to pause, to breathe it in. She had spent so long defending herself, preparing for disappointment, that allowing this quiet, gentle closeness felt revolutionary. He stopped, turning to face her, the soft wind tousling his hair. "I meant what I said," he continued, a faint tremor in his voice betraying the vulnerability he rarely displayed. "About being partners, about this." He hesitated, searching her eyes for any sign of rejection, but finding none, he let a small, rueful smile break through. "I was wrong that first day. I never should have doubted you." Elaine felt the last of her defenses crumble, a long-held tightness in her chest finally easing. The old sting of humiliation, the memories of being underestimated, and the years of self-doubt felt distant, almost trivial against the clarity of this moment. She reached out her hand, bridging the space between them with a simple, deliberate gesture. Michael's hand met hers, warm and reassuring, and for the first time, Elaine allowed herself to fully trust, to fully hope. They walked the remainder of the path in silence, fingers entwined, letting the city and the lake and the sinking sun carry them. No words were necessary. The quiet triumph of connection spoke louder than any declaration. Each step was a conscious choice, a mutual acknowledgement that they had found each other not by chance, but by perseverance and courage. Elaine felt a deep, steady joy, not flashy or frantic, but rich and sustaining. As the last sliver of sun disappeared beneath the horizon, their reflections in the water shimmered and faded, yet their closeness remained. The night air was cooler now, carrying with it the scent of water and distant city lights. Elaine leaned slightly into Michael, comfortable in the trust that had grown between them. The world around them seemed to soften, the tensions of the past weeks melting into the calm of the present. Sometimes love comes late, but when it comes with respect, with acknowledgement of scars and growth, isn't that the best kind? Elaine thought of all the missteps, the nearly lost opportunities, the careful walls she had built to protect herself. None of that mattered now. What mattered was a gentle, deliberate choice to walk beside someone who valued her for all that she was, and who let her see him in return. She smiled, not at him, not at herself, but at the simple, profound truth of the moment. The path curved slightly, and Michael squeezed her hand lightly, a silent promise of presence and patience. Elaine felt the quiet strength of partnership, the warmth of something more than business, more than survival. She didn't need assurances beyond this. The hand she held was enough. Their reflections in the water wavered, but remained side by side, a delicate mirror of the harmony they had begun to forge together. And as the evening settled fully over Lake Michigan, Elaine realized she could finally let herself hope fully, without reservation for both love and life. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, in moments of quiet courage, or in the spaces between embarrassment and pride. Life has a way of humbling us, showing us our own fragility, and yet, it also opens doors to strength we didn't know we had. It reminds us that respect and trust can bloom slowly, and that choosing ourselves after years of giving to others is not selfish, it is necessary. Even after mistakes, misunderstandings, or heartbreak, there is room to reclaim dignity, to stand tall, and to let someone see the real you without fear. And sometimes, the people who challenge us the most are also the ones who help us discover what we are truly capable of. Quiet moments, small gestures, and unexpected connections can change the course of our days if we allow ourselves to notice them. In the end, it's okay to take a breath, to let the past settle, and to step gently into something new. Warmth can come softly, and hope, once thought lost, can feel like coming home. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. Your presence means more than words can say. It reminds us why sharing these moments matters. Every like, share, and subscribe is a gentle way to spread kindness and keep stories like this alive. Wishing you warmth, peace, and quiet moments of joy as you carry on with your day.